All right, so we are now recording. We'd like to welcome Steve to our group. Stephen, I'm going to let you tell us your last name and your bio, and you're on. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. My name is Steve Iowanu, and I'm a writer based in Buffalo, New York, so not too far away from you. I've been writing for well over 30 years. I thought I'd be one of those guys that would be on the 30 under 30 list, or the 40 under 40 list, or the 50 under 50 list, and that never happened. So even though I've been writing all this time, my first novel just came out this past June. It's called Rook, and it is based on the life of a person from Buffalo, a man named Al Nussbaum. And Al grew up here in Buffalo in the 1950s, smartest guy in the class, married his high school sweetheart, had a couple businesses going. He had an electronics business, a print shop, and claims to have opened the first Mexican restaurant in Buffalo. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's his claim. And he'd tell his wife, Lolly, that periodically that he was going out of town for business. But Al's real business was robbing banks. And he robbed about half a dozen banks before Lolly or the FBI knew who he was. And when I learned about this, it was about 10 years ago. It was a Sunday morning. I was reading the Buffalo News in the kitchen, and there was an article entitled "The Strange True Tale of a Buffalo Bank Robber Turned Crime Novelist." And they hooked me at the title of the article. I go, who is this guy? And that's how I learned about Al in the very beginning. So as I said, he robbed about 6 banks until the FBI found out who he was. And the reason they found out who he was because a bank robbery in Brooklyn went terribly, terribly wrong. And his one-eyed partner, Bobby Wilcoxon, shot and killed a bank guard and wounded a New York City police officer. And that put Al and Bobby and their other partner, Curry, at the top of the most wanted list. And Al had to go on the run. So I read all this information was in that first Buffalo News article. And so I knew I wanted to write about this man because, and I guess the part I didn't tell you is that once he was caught, no spoilers, but while he was in prison, he became a writer, and he was writing for Mike Shane, Alfred Hitchcock, Ellery Queen, a penny a word guy. When he was paroled, he went out to Hollywood and wrote for television. So he actually had a second act of his life we'll talk about in a little bit. So that was all in that first Buffalo News article. So I was fascinated, and I decided I wanted to write about him. So what I thought I'd talk to you about today, and at any point, please stop and ask questions, make this interactive, is kind of how my journey of how I put this book together, because I think it's relevant for anyone who's trying to write historical fiction, but really from a broad perspective, really any type of novel. So once I read that article, I wanted to know more about Al. So of course, first place I head is to the Buffalo Central Library, get on the microfiche machine and start reading all the newspaper articles from 1961, 1962, when all this took place. And there was a lot of articles. Al was national news. He was featured on the Walter Cronkite CBS Evening News because while he was on the road, on the lam running from the FBI, he was still robbing banks and they couldn't catch him. And he robbed 3 or 4 more because he had this harebrained scheme that he was going to come back to Buffalo, get his wife and baby, and flee to Brazil because they didn't have extradition, and was going to restart his life. And he needed money for that, so he kept robbing banks. And they couldn't catch him. He was robbing banks all up and down the East Coast. He stole about $2.5 million in today's money. Reader's Digest offered a $10,000 reward for his arrest. Over 1 million wanted posters were printed up and distributed about Al. So he was big news. J. Edgar Hoover called him the most cunning fugitive alive. So I had all this information from the articles. I got his FBI file under the Freedom of Information Act, which anybody can do. Since then, they've updated their website, and it's much easier to request information now. So if you're writing a historical novel or even nonfiction, go out to the, just Google Freedom of Information Act. It'll take you to the website. It's much, much easier than it was 10 years ago when I started this book. So I was able to get that information. And it was really interesting because it's been, 60 years since this all took place. Just about everyone has died. And it was amazing how much of the FBI record was still redacted. So I thought that was really interesting. So if you read the book, all the dates, the times, the cars, the weapons, the amount of money, the disguises, all that's right from the FBI files. I also got his prison record. We'll talk about that part in a little bit as well. Again, back then it was a different process to get his prison record, and it was much more difficult. But again, everyone's able to do this with the proper documentation. I was able to get on eBay, all his writings that Mike Shane and Ellery Queen and Alfred Hitchcock. I was able to bid on those and get those magazines, as well as a copy of the Reader's Digest that featured his story and the reward. So I kept doing all this research until I just felt full. I didn't have like a deadline, like November 1, I'm going to start writing. I just kept, you know how it is when you do research. You read one book and it references another article. So you find that article and it references another author. And one of the authors I found was an author named Charles Kelly, who wrote a book called Gunshots in Another Room, The Forgotten Life of Dan J. Marlowe. And I don't know if you recognize Dan J. Marlowe's name, but he was a crime writer from the 60s and 70s, who was a Pulp Fiction guy. He befriended Al, became his writing mentor while Al was in prison. And when Al was paroled, they actually lived together, and Al became his caretaker. Great information in that book. And that book was just, the movie rights were just sold for that book. So I had all this information about Al. And then when I felt full, when I felt ready to create my fictional account of the events, I started writing. But it didn't start out as a novel. I told you when I opened my opening remarks that I've been writing 30 years without any success, and that's true. I had 3 or 4 failed novels in my drawer, but I did have a collection of short stories that came out. It was well received, won some awards. So I said, well, I know how to write short stories. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write novellas. I'll write a novella because those are so lucrative and everyone reads novellas, right? So my idea was I'll write 3 novellas that are linked together about 3 parts of Al's life, from the bank robbery years, the prison years, and then his post-prison life. I wrote those 3 novellas, turned it into my publisher, the short story novel, my short story collection. And he said, this is a novel. It's not 3 novellas. Write the novel. Don't be afraid. And so I said, okay. And so I think that brings me to my second point. The first point with historical fiction, do your research. The second point is define the time frame and the plot points that's going to take place, the novel is going to take place, which seems really basic, right? But now I'm thinking, okay, how do I structure 30 years of this man's life? How is that going to work? And I talked to one of my friends, Ashley Warlick, who is a novelist, more of a literary, writes more literary fiction than crime fiction. And she said, well, I'm really fascinated by Al's wife, Lolly. And I thought about it and I said, well, yeah, I mean, Lolly was in the trio of novellas. But I started thinking more about what Ashley had said about Lolly, and something kind of clicked. It's like, here's a woman who did not know that her husband was robbing banks, has an infant daughter, and her whole world imploded. Now the FBI are chasing her husband. They are camped outside her house. They're monitoring her phone, her mail, they're questioning her. Buffalo's a small town, and now she's known as the bank robber's wife. She had to change her name. She couldn't get a job because no one wanted to hire her. No one would come to their house because they were afraid of getting a shootout with the FBI and Al. And I go, wow, that's right. It was right in front of me the whole time. I want to write about Lolly. So I said, okay, my structure for the novel, it'll still be the 3 parts: bank robber life, prison life, post-prison, 3 parts of the book instead of 3 novellas. And the only way I can make it work in that bank robbing life, if I want to have Lolly in it, is to alternate chapters and points of view. 1 chapter from Al's point of view on the run, 1 chapter about Lolly's life left behind. And so I started writing that. And that was the novel. What was supposed to be just 1 part of a book, it became the full novel. So I never got to the second half of Al's life. My novel went from 30 years to 11 months in terms of the plot points, because I was fascinated by Lolly, and I think it's the most exciting part of Al's life. And so I tell people who haven't read it, who are thinking about it, that Rook is as much about a bank robber as it is about a marriage coming to an end. And it just worked. Lolly became, I tell people, the broken heart of the book, because she really was very naive. She really was very innocent, and her whole world was turned upside down. So the structure of the book became much different than my original vision of it. But all that work, all those 3 novellas, all that research, including what happened after Al's arrest, all that was worth doing because it allowed me to create a fuller picture of Al. And I knew the story, even if that part isn't on the page, it just made me feel more comfortable. And then the actual writing and rewriting of the novel became much easier once I had figured out the structure of it and the time frame. So if you're writing a historical novel that is set in the 1800s, you may not have as much information as I had to my disposal, very focused. But I think the challenge is even sometimes greater. What do I want to focus in on? So once I kind of overcame that, that everything fell into place, and Lolly was the key. One thing on the research that I didn't do, that I tried to do, was to reach out to people who live that life, who were actually there. Al had passed away in 1996. I knew that Lolly, his wife, was still in the area in Buffalo. I knew his daughter was, because she was interviewed in that original Buffalo Evening News article that I read. And she was about my age, a little older. So I reached out to Allison, the daughter, who's just a baby in the book, right when I was starting my research. And she never responded. I think I emailed her twice. And I figured, well, how would I feel if someone emailed me out of the blue and says, hey, I want to fictionalize your family, right? I want to co-opt your family. And I get it. So it was fine. The book comes out in June. I get interviewed by a local, the NBC affiliate here, about Al. And I didn't know this until they ran this segment, that the reporter, Pete Gallivan, tracked down Allison, the daughter, who lives in Syracuse, about 2 hours away from where I live. And she was in that piece, that news piece that about Al. So it was me and her were basically the 2 people who were interviewed. And Pete Gallivan, the reporter, gave her my contact information. And she wrote me a lovely email apologizing for not responding to my emails from 9-10 years ago. But right when I started writing the book, her mom, Lolly, who's the main character of the book, suffered a stroke. Allison had to take care of her. Then her mom passed away, and Allison had to deal with the estate. She had a business. She was a seamstress here in town. And then Allison was in a car crash, and then she had health issues, and then COVID hit, and then she lost my email address. But she wrote, we started exchanging emails, and she goes, man, I have all these great details that, you could have included in your novel. And I said, well, like what? She goes, my mom did not know that my dad was robbing banks when you go on these business trips, and she can never figure out why he'd come home from these business trips and immediately go to the bathroom and throw up. And I said, oh, that would have been a great detail to work in, right? But I finally got to meet Allison about 2 weeks ago. I was at the Albany Book Festival, driving back, and I stopped in Syracuse, and we chatted for about an hour about her dad, her life, my writing life, and it was really great and supportive to meet her. So if you're writing a historical novel, recent history, and you have the opportunity to, and again, this is probably basic stuff, but I was learning as I was going, to interview someone who was there, even on the periphery, you never know what detail they may offer up. So if you're, and now with Zoom, all the technology that we have, even if she lived in California, we could have connected before that. So when you think about research, if you can talk to these people in person, that would be the best thing to do to get those details that really flesh out your characters. So I talk way too much. I'm happy to open it up to questions or comments or anything you'd like to talk about. This is your time.
Stephen, I have a question. This is Linda. You talked about the family, and what legal pitfalls or what legal things do you look out for before you do write about a real character? Like what types of things do you do in order to make sure that you're protected?
I didn't do anything. Here was my perspective. Everything was public record. This did take place. The basic facts of it are true. Al Nussbaum was a public figure, and everything is a public record. So 60 years had gone by. So I didn't feel like I was exposed. The publishers didn't feel like they were exposed at all. And if you read the book, everybody turns out really well. They're portrayed very well in the book, except really two people. Bobby, Al's sociopathic partner, who was a sociopath, and he died on death row. He had a nephew that's out in California where Bobby's from, and I never heard from him. And then Al's mother-in-law, Lolly's mother, because remember, Al had this harebrained scheme of getting his wife and baby and running to South America. Well, he tried it, and he came back to Buffalo to get his wife and baby, and it was his mother-in-law who called the FBI. That led to a high-speed chase to the city of Buffalo, and Al was caught, and he was sentenced to 40 years in prison, served 14, but it was his mother-in-law who turned it in. So I made her not a very likable character just because she's the one that dropped the dime on Al. So when I met Allison, I told her that. I said, I think everyone in your family comes off really well, except your grandmother. She may have been like the sweetest grandmother in the world, but I needed a villain. I needed an antagonist. And she was it. And she just kind of laughed, and it didn't sound like her mother-in-law was the sweet grandmother, because she kind of glossed over that. But I wasn't really worried legally, and my publisher wasn't worried legally. So we just went with what I wrote, and like I said, everything was public record that's based on.
So if the daughter gives you information that's not necessarily public record, it's kind of new info for you, like that vomiting. Do you have to put any certain acknowledgement about that in the front of the book, in the front matter, or?
Not legally. As a courtesy, a professional courtesy, I would have. And so there's no obligation to do that. And like I said, I wish, and I understand why she didn't, but I wish she would have had responded to those emails, because I don't think the book would have fundamentally changed at all. But one thing, she said her dad had this great sense of humor. That doesn't come out in the book because I really didn't know that part of his life. And it was sort of infectious and would bring the humor out in other people. So Al was always being invited to parties because he was that type of guy, big personality. And she told me this great story, and I had read about it when I was doing my research. It's not in the book because it was in the prison years. While he was in Leavenworth, it was his high school reunion. Al was a likable guy. Everyone liked Al. So as a joke, they sent him an invitation addressed to, Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary or whatever the official name is of Leavenworth, Al Nussbaum, prisoner number 1234, blah, blah, blah. And Al gets invited to his high school reunion while he's in prison. And he wrote a very funny letter back to the reunion committee explaining why he couldn't possibly attend this year, but he hoped in the future that he would be able to. So yeah, if Allison had been giving me information about that, I would have had a line in the author's notes, the acknowledgements page, thanking her. Because she didn't have to do that. So just out of a courtesy, you would do it, but not out of any type of legal obligation.
And just without monopolizing, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Recently had a conversation with somebody about writing this stuff because, for instance, a lot of people that do help out with books, for instance, I have a book coming out next month that I was working with a lieutenant at the City Park Police. And the publisher and I had a conversation because of certain books. We were looking at a Randy Wayne White book and other books that is common in this. You'll see authors say, so-and-so helped me, but any misinformation, whatever, is all mine. So we were having a conversation about how that works out. That's why I was wondering, if you have to make that statement or if there was ever any concern about that, because ours is all fiction. So, I mean, it's public record.
I didn't with Rook. I've got a book coming out next year called Yesteryear. Again, it's historical fiction, and I changed things. I compressed some timelines. I moved some locations around just because it fit the plot. And so in my author's note, I acknowledged that I had done that, and I did have a sentence in there. Any other historical inaccuracies, consider it my fault or poetic license or however I worded it, but it didn't have to go through legal or anything like that to have that comment in there.
Yeah,
It
because
also helps head off the letters of complaint that you get.
Yeah,
Fifth Avenue's one way, the other way, or whatever.
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
and certain collaborators won't work with you unless you put that in there, because they'll tell you some stuff, but they don't know how it's going to be represented.
Right.
So that's a big point about not calling you back to help you out with your book.
Well, my ego took over when she didn't respond. I was like, oh, she's like, does she have the lawyers? Like, does she have like a Google search on my name? Is she having coming out with her own book? And none of that. It was life got in the way, and there were other things going on that were much more important than some guy in Buffalo trying to write a novel and get it published. So,
and I just thought it interesting because that was kind of a national Cincy conversation. So I thought that. Eileen.
Yeah, I have a question. Hi.
Yeah. Hi.
With your novel, how did you go about developing the dialogue, especially since it's a historical and you don't know all the words? How did you go? Was it some imagination?
Completely.
How did you develop it?
Completely. So again, the book alternates chapters from Lolly's point of view and Al's point of view. There was no record of what Lolly's life was like in Buffalo, except some anecdotal things I picked up along the way of research. So all that is my invention. I try to put my mind into the mind of a 24-year-old single mom, high school graduate, can't get a job, hounded by the police, hounded by the reporters. How would I have responded to that? So all that is purely, my imagination. 1961 is not too that far back. So there are cultural references to the Kennedys, to some pop music that was on the radio, certainly to the Cars, the local DJ at the time. So there were elements to anchor it in that era. But certainly all of Lolly's, all of Al's interior monologue, that's the creative part. That's the fiction part that I brought to the table, to the real story, the actual story.
We have another Eileen with a question.
Actually, I was going to ask a very similar question, especially about Lolly's. I just wondered how you indicated that it was very much fictionalized, because I could see somebody taking situations saying this is a terrific situation. I'm just going to change all the names so that I don't get in. I'm not portraying something that didn't happen. So it sounds like you were able to research certain things very in depth, but other things like Lolly's experiences you weren't. So is there somewhere that you indicated what was what in the prologue?
So it was hard to hear, but I think the question is, especially from Lolly's point of view, when I was writing the book, how did I handle the fictional aspects of her, and did I need to acknowledge that? Was that the question?
Yes, that's the question.
Okay, yeah. So this is a novel. It's fiction. So that's the assumption that the fact that the reader has to accept if they decide to read my book. This is a novel. This is not Al Nussbaum's biography. This is a fictionalized accounting of his life. The basic points are right. The dates are right. What happened to Al's historically correct. But the relationships, the dialogue, that was all my invention. So as a novelist, you don't have to say, hey, this is true, this is what I made up. We can talk about those things in group settings like this or over a drink. But to the reader who just pulls my book off the shelf, it's a novel, it's fiction. They just happen to be based on true life characters. So I didn't acknowledge that anywhere. I just feel like it's assumed with a historical novel.
Questions? Anyone else with a question? So, Roberta?
How did you go about getting it published?
Interesting story. I kind of left that part out. So if we go back, the publisher of my short story collection, called Muscle Cars, the publisher who told me that he didn't like the idea of 3 novellas, be brave, write the novel. I write the novel, I hand it to him, and he didn't like it. He passed on it. And the reason he did is he didn't like Lolly's portion of it. He was looking for a true crime genre novel. And like I said, it's partially that, but partially it's about the end of a love story. And he didn't want that. He thought it'd be a better book and it would be more marketable, easier to sell, if it was a straight bank robber, bang 'em up, shoot 'em type of book. And I wasn't really interested in rewriting it that way, because I was Lolly really captured my imagination about what it would have been like to be in her situation. So it was it was just a disagreement on the direction of the book. There were no hard feelings. In fact, he's publishing my next 2 books that are coming out. But now I have to find the publisher for this. So the traditional crime publishers said, hey, you know what? This is like half a crime book. Can you rewrite it and not have the wife in it? And I go, I like the wife. And one rejection was, you wrote a novel. Instead of like a crime novel, I wrote a novel. And I said, yeah. I mean, I wasn't thinking about how to market the book or sell the book or in secondary rights. I was trying to write the best book I could, and Lolly made the book complete as far as my artistic vision was. so I had a tough time finding a publisher. And so I just kept submitting, taking my lumps, getting rejected, thinking, man, this is going to be another failed novel that goes in the drawer with the other 3 or 4 that are sitting there. And then a publisher, Unsolicited Press out of Portland, they got it. They liked it. They liked Lolly, and they published it. And it was delayed a little bit because of COVID, but it came out last June. And I've been very busy promoting the book, and it's been a lot of fun. And not one reader, not any of the emails that said, I don't like Lolly's part. I think especially the female readers, the women readers that have approached me, they said I normally wouldn't have picked up a book like that, but Lolly was the hook for them. So that made me feel a little bit that I was right.
Any other questions? So I'm sure your SincNJ chapter has been excited to promote you and things like that. So that's great. You're up in Buffalo, New York?
Yep, I'm in Buffalo. I'm always willing to hop in the car or hop on Zoom and meet with folks and do readings. So keep me in mind. Just a couple more things just about Al, just because I love telling his story. He did get out of prison, and he did go out to Hollywood to become a writer, but he stopped in Nevada on the way to LA because he had buried money out in the desert 14 years earlier. And so he was going to dig it up, and that was going to be his, start over money. He was infamous for hiding money and weapons all over the place so he could get to them. But 14 years had passed, and he got there, and where he had buried the suitcase full of money was now a strip mall. So either one of the construction guys got that bag of money, or it's still sitting under all that cement. And so he didn't get his seed money for LA. You as crime writers and crime fiction readers will appreciate that he became head of a local chapter of Mystery Writers of America when he was out in California, and he won an award for them. And they asked him at like the Q&A session when he got this award, they said, Al, you've had this whole second act to your life, whole second career as a writer. What do you think about that? And he said, writing's fine, but I'd rather be robbing banks because he loved the thrill of it. The book is called Rook because he was a chess player and a very good chess player. And it was all a game to him, trying to fool the FBI, develop these plans, escape routes. And he's quoted as saying, robbing banks was chess for cash prizes. It was all a big game to him. He never went in the banks. He controlled Bobby and Curry with walkie-talkies and just moving pieces around. So he's really a fascinating man. He probably could have been anything he wanted, but he decided that he wanted to be a criminal for the money, for the adrenaline rush, what have you. And then he decided he wanted to be a crime writer, write about what you know, right? And if you think about that, if you went to, Killer Nashville, or if you went to BoucherCon in Minneapolis, and he was there, as crime writers, as readers of crime fiction, we all would have gravitated to him because in the 1970s and 80s with crime fiction writers, he had a certain panache because he lived that life. He carried the Tommy guns. He robbed the banks. He was in Leavenworth and Marion. So he had a certain standing in the writing community because of that. So he was a smart guy. He played that up. So if you were a Killer Nashville and he handed you a bookmarker or one of his business cards, guess what? He had his wanted poster, his mugshot printed on those things because that was the way of him marketing himself in the second career that he enjoyed. So a fascinating guy. So he had me hooked from that article.
There we go. Anybody else? Well, thank you, Steve. We appreciate you stopping by.
Yeah, thank you. Best of luck to everybody and stay safe. And I hope to see you again. Take care.
Oh, wait, do you have a question?
It's not literally related. It's fun asking one thing.
Sure, I'm still here.
Hey, so where are you in Buffalo?
I am, if you're familiar with the city, I am right in the city down by the Peace Bridge in the Front Park neighborhood. In fact, I can see Canada from my window up here on the 3rd floor.
Okay, my aunt lives in North Tonawanda. That's why I asked.
Okay, yeah, I grew up in Kenmore, so it was kind of like, you know, Buffalo, Kenmore, Tonawanda, North Tonawanda. It was those northern suburbs where I'm from. So that's cool. That's cool.
So
We're doing that kind of question. Frank's or the other one?
Was there another? That's it?
Yeah.
All right.
We're doing that kind of question. Frank's Wings or the other one?
So my favorite chicken wing place, it's called Gabriel's Gate on Allen. It's better than Duff's. It's better than the Anchor Bar. So if you're in town, look up Gabriel's Gate, and they got the best wings in town.
Steve, I have one other question. Today at our
Sure.
meeting, we international chapters, and I was just curious, are you, did you connect with the Canadian chapter of Sisters in Crime at all?
I haven't. I'm a member of the Murder on Ice, the Central and Western New York chapter. I haven't reached out yet to the folks in Canada, but I certainly will. It's easier now to get across the border. Yeah, I hope to do that this fall.
Yeah, I was wondering. I think I looked it up though, and it's in Alberta, so it's
Yeah.
really
I think I won't be driving there, but I think there's also one in Toronto, but I might be wrong about that. But yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you again. It was great hearing
Thank
about
you.
your book. We wish you well.
Thank you. And if you think of other questions, just go out to my website and you can shoot me an email there.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.